to let you guys know is, as a church, tonight, our community coming together, tonight, our faith family coming together is a huge deal. So even if you're kind of on the fence, even if you're thinking, I should stay home and watch the Cowboys, not a good idea, okay? God is going to use that as an opportunity to destroy them, so do not give God any extra ammunition, okay? So, in all reality, 6 o'clock, we're going to start about 6:15. Baptism will be over at 6:30-ish, and we're going to open up the pool and let you guys hang out. If you want to leave after that, that's fine. If you want to stay around and connect with people, even better. But they're going in right now, all these kids who just left, to learn about Elisha. They've been going through the Gospel Project now for a year and a couple of months, and we have joined in with them. So today we're going to talk about Elisha as well. For the last couple of weeks, we started with Elisha's mentor, Elijah, and we talked about how Elijah had this roller coaster of a life. He got taken off to be isolated. He got grown and shaped by God. He got to call down fire from heaven, but then went into this depression. And God was able to use that for His glory and His honor, and then pass the baton onto this guy by the name of Elisha. And Elisha we started talking about last week, and one of the things that we didn't talk about last week is something I just want to touch on today. That even as we look at the life of Elisha, because we're taking this 3-year trek through the Gospel Project, we can't focus on every little detail. But something I failed to focus on last week that we talked about in our connection group was this. If you remember the story, Elisha was approached by Elijah. He said, you know what? I'm going all in. I'm going to burn the plows. I'm going to burn the yoke. I'm going to slaughter my oxen, and we're going to have a big, giant barbecue. Although during our connection group, Jared actually read from his, and it said they boiled the meat, which made me actually grossed out just a little bit. Because Rudy's doesn't boil meat, and there's a reason for it, okay? Because barbecue is better. So we're going to stick with the barbecue idea in it all. So he has this giant barbecue, but who did he have the barbecue for? Does anyone remember? Everybody else. He had a giant community thing take place. The question came up during our connection group was, why? Why did he involve everybody else? Why did he go back and say, I'm going to take everything that I've been given, I'm going to give it to everybody else, but I want everybody else to see the decision that I'm making, isn't it? Isn't it for accountability? Isn't it for celebration? Isn't it for that next step? That's why tonight is so important for our church to come together to celebrate, for accountability, for connection in all of those areas. It's kind of like a wedding. When you go to a wedding and you're a part of the crowd, you know why that family invited you? Why that couple invited you? Sometimes it's just out of obligation. But for the most part, it's out of the fact that they want you to be a part of their relationship together. Or that you've played a giant part of their relationship together. And I always say at a wedding that if you are there, it is your job to hold these two accountable. When they're going in good times, celebrate with them. When they're going through bad times, walk with them. That is the options that is given to those who are invited to that wedding. Well, I think that's the same thing that we see with Elisha, and I think that's the same thing. And that's why I invite you to be a part tonight at the Rio Rancho Aquatic Center. So with that, we're going to jump ahead into the life of Elisha just a little bit more. If you have your Bibles with you, I would love for you to open up to 2 Kings chapter 6. Now, we're going to jump to 2 Kings chapter 6. And like I said, because the Gospel Project doesn't allow us to really focus on each and every step. Instead, we actually have the daily discipleship guides, and we have the things, and I'm going to email just one big one out on Monday, so your email boxes aren't getting bombarded all week long. But I'm going to just point out the fact that there's some things that are skipped that are very important that we're skipping today. See, in 2 Kings chapter 2, towards the end of the chapter, Elisha is going to Bethel. This isn't mentioned in the Gospel Project, but it's something we definitely need to talk about this morning. Because he's going to Bethel, and as he's going to Bethel, he's going in to share about his God. Now, there's been 18 years since fire from heaven, and everybody had turned back to God, and people are starting to fade away from God again. And these people come out, these actually 42, it says children in the actual translation, but that could be anywhere up to teenagers or so. But they came out and they mocked him. And they said, we don't want your God in our place anymore. Go away, Baldy. And they kept calling him Baldy and Baldy. So what he does, maybe you've heard this story before, but what he does is he calls down 2 female bears from the mountains. They come down and they maul all 42 of these kids. The moral of the story is don't make fun of a bald man of God, okay? Because things can happen. That's the reason why we need to hold on to that one, okay? But as we skip past that, we're going to jump into 2 Kings chapter 6, and we're going to actually start in verse 8. First 7 verses are very important as well. I'm going to challenge you to read those on your own. But today, because we really have one focus, we're going to start in verse 8 and read through verse 23. Our focus today, this one focus is going to be on seeing. And that's a pun intended in that, by the way. But we're going to be seeing. And as we move into this passage, I want to ask you a question. One that has to do with these next steps. The next steps. We keep talking about the next steps. We keep kind of pushing you to what your next step would be. And it really has to do with the call of Elisha from last week. Going all in, burning the plows, doing the barbecue, doing all of this. The question I have for you today is this. Do you struggle with the idea of a next step? Are you afraid of what might happen next? See, Elijah went for it. And as far as we know, he didn't know much about it. It wasn't like Elijah came and he sat and said, here's what's going to happen next. And here's all the plan of action for the next 18 years. It was, I'm putting my mantle on you. You can follow me or you cannot. And that was the decision that he had to make. But what Elisha saw was something greater. We kept saying that last week, that even though he didn't know what it was, there was something greater out there. Even though he was sitting in the middle of something pretty good right there with the money and the oxen and the land and all servants and all the things we talked about last week, even though he still said there is something greater out there. But for us, responding as Elisha did may be difficult. Going all in may be difficult. Taking the next step is going to be scary. And maybe you are struggling to see. Maybe you are struggling to see God at work. Maybe you are struggling to see God's plan. Maybe you're struggling to see God's provision. You know, I heard an illustration this week that I thought was really appropriate. How many of you guys have gone through a TSA scanner at the airport where you have to put your hands over your head and it goes whoosh, whoosh, around you, does that whole thing like that? What's the point of that? The point of that is to see the inside. Everything you've got on the inside. And I think sometimes we come into church and we only put on what's going on the outside, and that's all we want people to see. But if there was a TSA scanner that dug deep into your soul, that saw every bit of baggage that you've got in your life, whatever struggle that you're having, whatever addiction that you're dealing with, whatever it might be, if it showed deep down, and then that report came and sat on my desk, and as it sat on my desk, I was able to pass it out to other people, would we look at each other differently? Would we understand that there is a struggle of taking that next step? Would we understand that there's a scary thing that is out there? We're struggling to see God at work, but maybe with that scanner we can see where He's doing things. Or are we struggling to see God's plan? Maybe with that scanner or the provision, it's all there. See, maybe we're struggling to see that something greater. Maybe even more so, we're struggling just to see something good. We're not even worried about greater, because right now anything is greater than where we're at. Maybe that is our struggle. But what it boils down to is 2 words. 2 words, and those 2 words are spiritual blindness. Spiritual blindness. And that can be for the believer, and it can be for the unbeliever. It can be the one who follows Christ and has for a long time in their life, or somebody who really doesn't have any idea even what that means. Spiritual blindness, it can affect us all. See, I think one of the most tragic causes of the fall of man back in the book of Genesis was spiritual blindness. Unable to see who God is, what God is doing, and the worst part about it is that we're unaware that we're blind. We're unaware that we're blind. We think we can still see, and today we're going to see it both in the servants of God we're also going to see it in the enemies of God. We're going to see it in the servants of God. We're going to see it in the enemies of God. And then we're going to see Elisha do a miracle to both. He's going to open their eyes. He's going to pray that God opens their eyes. Now, I want to give you just a quick little tidbit of information about Elisha before we jump in. He's actually known as the greater prophet. And his whole life is pointing forward to Christ. And Christ is going to do the same things in a greater degree. So even as we read 2 Kings chapter 6, I want you to see it as it points to Christ. Because his ministry existed to demonstrate the saving power of God. As a matter of fact, his name, Elisha, means God, Elisha, salvation. Just like when we looked at Elijah, his meant, our God is the one true God. My God is the one true God. We see the same thing in the name Elisha here, that God saves. So if you haven't opened there yet with your Bibles, I would love for you to go to 2 Kings chapter 6, starting in verse 8, because this is what it says. When the king of Aram, which is Syria, by the way, was waging war against Israel, he conferred with his servants, my camp will be at such and such a place. But the man of God sent word to the king of Israel, be careful passing by this place, for the Arameans are going down there. Consequently, the king of Israel sent word to the place the man of God had told him about. The man of God repeatedly warned the king, so the king would be on his guard. The king of Aram was enraged because of this matter, and he called his servants and demanded of them, tell me which one of us is for the king of Israel? Who's the rat? Who's the one that is giving up our secrets? Who's the mole on the inside of this? One of his servants said this in verse 12. No one, my lord the king. Elisha, the prophet in Israel, tells the king of Israel even the words you speak in your bedroom. So Elisha was the original Google, Siri, Alexa that is listening in on everything. Okay, so you have to think it's the original NSA tapping the emails as we see it all play itself out. So verse 13, the king says this, go and see where he is so I can send men to capture him. When he was told, Elisha is in Dothan, he sent horses, chariots, and a massive army there. So after one guy, he's sending this massive delegation to go capture him. They went by night and they surrounded the city. When the servant of the man of God got up early and went out that next morning, he discovered an army with horses and chariots surrounding the city. So he asked Elisha, oh, my master, what are we to do? Now, I'm not sure how many of you heard this story before. This is pretty impressive right here. Elisha says, don't be afraid, for those who are with us outnumber those who are with them. This servant sees 2 against 1,000, or more than 1,000, this massive army with chariots and all the things that are going on. Verse 17 says, then Elijah prayed, Lord, please open his eyes and let him see. So the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he saw the mountain was covered with horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. So this first part, we see the blindness of the believer. His eyes were opened. Second part is here in verse 18. When the Arameans came against him, Elisha prayed to the Lord, please strike this nation with blindness. So he struck them with blindness, and according to Elisha's word. Then Elisha said to them, this is not the way, and this is not the city. Now, I'm not sure how many of you guys are Star Wars fans in here, but I'm picturing Obi-Wan Kenobi sitting, and he's got the droids, and he's got Luke Skywalker and that land speeder, and he tells those stormtroopers, these are not the droids that you're looking for. The response is, these are not the droids that we're looking for. And they move on. This mind change happens. It says they were struck with blindness, but I believe, and what I've seen in all the commentaries, is it wasn't a physical blindness, but more of a delusional blindness. They saw what they wanted to see. Or Elijah let them see what he wanted them to see. He says, instead, this is what we want. Follow me, and I will take you to the man that you're looking for. So in this delusional state, they were struck with this weird sort of blindness that they didn't quite understand. My family likes to watch America's Funniest Home Videos. I'm not sure if you do as well, but on America's Funniest Home Videos, there's almost always a segment of somebody coming out of having their wisdom teeth pulled. And they have this weird delusional thinking they know what's going on, but they're completely clueless. That is what I picture here. They're blind to the reality of the truth. Kind of sounds like society today, doesn't it? But this is what it says next. He led them to Samaria. Now, if we go to the New Testament, we see that Samaria was a bunch of half-breeds, a bunch of half-Jew, half-Gentiles, and it wasn't a big thing. But in the Old Testament, it's actually where the capital of Israel was and where the king of Israel and his army was. So the fact that he's leading them there is a big deal. Another point is it was 10 to 12 miles from Dothan where they're at. What do you talk about during a 3 to 4 hour march with a giant army that you've got under delusion? Something to think about, just one of those things that popped in my head. Verse 20, when they entered Samaria 3 to 4 hours later, Elisha said, Lord, open these men's eyes and let them see. So the Lord opened their eyes, and they saw that they were in the middle of Samaria. If you're in the middle of enemy territory, surrounded by the middle of the enemy's whole army, what is your immediate response? I'm thinking, oh, crud, might be something in there. And the response of their once was reality becoming an actual reality was probably very difficult for them to process. And then look at how the king of Israel responds talking to Elijah. He says, when the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elijah, should I kill him? Should I kill him? Should I kill him, my father? You know that little bit of joy inside, right? You just delivered up the entire army right here. All we have to do is plunk. It's like fish in a barrel, right? That's it. You're going to take care of everybody. But look what Elijah says. He says, don't kill them. Do you kill those you've captured with your sword or bow? By the way, you haven't captured these. These are the ones that God has delivered into your hands. We don't slaughter our prisoners of war. These are God's, and he brought them here. Instead, what are we going to do? We're going to set food and water in front of them so they can eat and drink and go to their master. Well, that doesn't sound very Old Testament-like. So he prepared a big feast for them, and when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away, and they went to their master. And this last line is pretty cool. And the Aramean raiders did not come into Israel's land again. We're going to dive deeper into this, but just real quick. As I said, this points ahead to Christ. Isn't the goal of Christ to make enemies of God friends and family of God? Isn't he bringing them into their family? Isn't he changing that, opening the eyes of the blind? That's what we see here today. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at two different groups here today. First, the blindness of the believer, and second, the blindness of the unbeliever. In verse 15 and 16, you saw that Elijah's servant was terrified. You saw that he was struggling because he saw the size of the army that was against him. And the problem was he was blind to see the size of the army that was for him. And for them, that blindness caused doubt. He doubted the steadfastness of God. Steadfast means to be consistent or the unchanging character of God. That God is for you, not against you. They struggled with that. He doubted the strength of God's power. He thought that God had abandoned them. He thought there was no hope. He thought that somehow, some way, that God wasn't who he says he was. He had lost faith in God. He thought that maybe somehow he had to step in to do something himself because God wasn't going to come through. Funny thing is, I think that's the baseline for sin, isn't it? When we think that somehow God is going to let us down, therefore we have to do something ourselves. I mean, if I were to ask you this question, why do you reject God's ways and pursue your own path? Why do you constantly think you have to earn God's love? Why do you have to earn salvation? I think it's because we blindly believe that God is not trustworthy. We don't trust him. We don't trust in his plan. We don't trust in his story. The reason we are afraid, the reason why we're afraid and worried, the reason why we're afraid to take the next step is because we don't believe God's promises. Elisha believed God's promise. Sometimes we don't. Probably more than sometimes we don't. We don't believe his promises that he's fighting for us. We don't believe his promises that says, I will never leave you or forsake you. We don't believe his promises that he talks about Romans 8:28, where it says, we know that in all things work together for the good of those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. Do we believe all things? See, we struggle to see God. We struggle to see God for who he is and what he's doing, especially when he's working behind the scenes in a way that we cannot grasp, because he's working behind the scenes on a plan for our life when we think we need to be working ahead and saying, God, you're not doing this the right way. Can I say that when we are struggle to see God? Can I say that when we are worried and we are afraid that we need to pray, just like Elisha did, for a clearer vision, for our eyes to be open? See, if you jump into the New Testament with me, you'll see that Paul prays for this at the church at Ephesus. He wants people to see who God is, and not even just see, but comprehend, be fully immersed in who God is, to have God be the feelings and the sight and the sounds and everything, be who God is. He prays for it first in the first chapter, 15 through 20 in Ephesians chapter 1. It says this, "This is why, since I've heard about your faith in the Lord Jesus and your love for all the saints, that I never stop giving thanks for you as I remember you in my prayers. I pray that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the glorious Father, would give you the spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of him. I pray your eyes are open." Then it goes on and says, "I pray that the eyes of your heart may be enlightened so that you may know what the hope of his calling is, what is the wealth of his glory inheritance in the saints, and what is the immeasurable greatness of his power towards us who believe according to the mighty working of his strength." I want you to see. I want you to feel how great God is. I want you to experience it. I want you to have full comprehension. So much so that just a few chapters later, and of course this is written in a letter, there wasn't chapters and verses, but he says, here's another prayer I want you to hold on to. It says this in verse 14 of chapter 3. "For this reason I kneel before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named. I pray that he may grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power in your inner being through his Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. I pray that you, being rooted and firmly established in love, may be able to comprehend." I want you to feel, I want you to see, I want you to fully grasp with all the saints what is the length and width, height and depth of God's love, and to know Christ's love that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with the fullness of God. He is excited. He wants these people to grasp it. He wants us to grasp it. But here is the problem. He truly wants people to experience God in all aspects of all the spiritual realm, in the physical realm, in the five senses. He wants them to experience God. But in trying to describe who God is, it's like trying to describe a sunset to a blind person. What are the words you're going to use? It's like trying to describe a symphony to a deaf person. When you are missing that sense, it's almost impossible to explain exactly what is going on. So instead he said, I want you to feel it. I want you to feel it. And he breaks down some words. As first, he says, I want you to understand the length of God's love. Back in the beginning of Ephesians, he said, God chose you and has loved you since the foundations of this very world. Before you were ever born, he had picked you. He wanted you to be a part of his family. Now, I don't even know how to fully describe the length, but that is a long, long time. But one thing I can do is this. It's like the picture of adoption, which Paul also mentions in that first chapter. We have a little girl over in Bulgaria. Christy got to meet her at the beginning of September. And as she got to meet her at the very beginning of September, she got to hold her and love her and squeeze her. And this little girl, Glory Kate, got to experience the love of a parent. But then Christy had to give her back and walk away. I still haven't had a chance to meet her yet. Between Thanksgiving and Christmas, I'm praying and praying and praying. Actually, I'm praying before that, but we're just going to lay that out there on the table. But I'm praying that there's a day between Thanksgiving and Christmas that I get to hold her in my own arms. But I can tell you that every night before I go to bed, when I set my alarm on my phone for the next morning, my phone's set to the world clock and it tells me the time in Sofia, Bulgaria. Because I know when I'm going to bed at 10, she's waking up the next morning at 7. They're 9 hours ahead of us. And I just pray for her that her day is going to be one that is full of love from those orphanage workers, that there's going to be one of those things. But I love her more than she could ever imagine. And she's never even met me yet. That's just a small picture of God's love for you before the foundation of the world. He has wanted you in his family. Can you feel the length of God's love? Then it says, I want you to understand the width of God's love. Did you know that God is sovereign over everything? There is not one thing that happens in our lives or anybody else's lives that is a surprise to him. There's not one thing that surprises him. See, God has a plan. As a matter of fact, go back to Ephesians chapter 1, verse 11. We were predestined according to the plan of the one who works out everything in agreement with the purpose of his will. Can I ask you a question? What is everything? Does it include the good things? Does it include the bad things? Everything is in process. The width, how wide is it? Can you feel that he has a plan for your life? And it's probably, scratch that, it is better than the plan that you have on your own. Can you feel the length? Can you feel the width? Can you experience it? I want you to understand, Paul says, the height of God's love. Psalm 103:11, the psalmist tries to explain it. It says, for as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his faithful love towards those who fear him. Can I ask you a question? Do you know how big the universe is? Some of you here can probably answer that question for me. You get into light years and spectrums and all, I don't know, all the things you would say. I'm not a science person, so I can't do it. But I can tell you this. It's huge. That's a scientific term. As a matter of fact, it's immeasurably huge. It's unbelievably huge. And it says here that as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his faithful love towards those who fear him. How high is God's love for you? It's huge. Huge. Okay? It is so big we can't fathom it. I want you just to try and comprehend, Paul says. And then it says this. Do you understand the depth of God's love? How deep is it? Well, I believe the answer is deep enough to go into the lowest hell to save us. How long? How wide? How high? How deep? Romans chapter 5, verses 6-8 says this. For while we were still helpless, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. For rarely will someone die for a just person, though for a good person, perhaps someone might even dare to die. But God. Those are two of my favorite words throughout the Bible. But God. I would love to write a book about the buts of God. But I can't even read a book very well, so I can't imagine trying to write one. Here's the thing. It says, but God proves his own love for us, and that while we were still sinners, while we were still enemies of his, Christ died for us. I know that's hard to understand, but can I ask you again, can you feel it? Can you feel the love of God, the height and the width and the depth and the length? Can you feel it? Open your eyes and see. Check out what Psalm 34:7-10 says. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and rescues them. Isn't that kind of what Elisha is dealing with here? Taste and see that the Lord is good. How happy is a person who takes refuge in him. You who are his holy ones, fear the Lord. For those who fear him lack nothing. Young lions lack food and go hungry, but those who seek the Lord will not lack any good thing. What if I could pray for you right now? And that I could be that bald man of God that Elisha is. And say, God, open their eyes. Open their eyes and let them see. See what you have for them next. See something greater. To see that you have a God who loves you. To see who you have a God who is for you. See a God who is fighting for you that is good. What if you could see? How would you respond? What if you could see what God was doing behind the scenes? I'm not sure how many of you here have a cell phone, but I'm going to guess about 100%. Does anybody know how those things work? How you can talk, waves and signals and bouncing off of towers. And when you turn on your radio in your car, if you still do that, you know how that works? When you put that popcorn in the microwave and you hit the button for it to start, do you know how that works? No, you get to see the results, but most of the time we don't fully grasp how it works. Same thing with God. as he works behind the scenes, as we see things and we get to see the results, how big would it be if we had our eyes open to what he was doing? But even a bigger question, how would you respond if you couldn't? How would you respond if you couldn't? That brings us, I think, to an interesting fact about our passage today, about where it happens. Did you know the place that all this happens is a place called Dothan? And Dothan's only mentioned one other time in the Bible. It's in Genesis chapter 37, verse 17. Maybe you know the story, but it's about a guy named Joseph. And Dothan is where Joseph meets up with his brothers who plan to kill him, but instead beat him up, throw him into a pit, sell him into slavery, which then leads to him becoming a slave, getting false accusations, having false imprisonment. In that false imprisonment, he is left in prison and forgotten by a butler. And then he somehow, some way, makes it to one of the lead people in all of Egypt. And as he does, he saves himself, he saves his family, and he saves really all of God's people. But in that pit in Dothan, that was not his prayer. And years went by in that process. Same place, my guess is, same angels, standing on the same hills all around, but a different answer to prayer. If Joseph had had his prayer answered in that pit, which I'm sure was like, God, get me out of this, how would the rest of the story go on? But God had a plan that was bigger. God was working in a different way. And God does the same thing in Elijah's life. We saw it. We're seeing it now in Elisha's life. If you know anything about King David, you see it in his life. If you know anything about Paul, who we read as he read through Ephesians, we read his letters to us and to the church there. We see it in his life. The question is, do you see it in yours? Do you see God working in yours? In the struggle, do you see the insight of God? In the midst of all the things you're going through, the setbacks, are they complete and utter failure, or do you see them as God's plan shaping you into something greater? Because that's where the spiritual blindness comes in. How can we open our eyes to God? How can we have Him help us see what He is doing? Pray for your eyes to be open. You know, I haven't even gotten to the second part of the story, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to hurry up real fast here. And I'm going to talk about the blindness of the unbelievers as well, okay? The blindness of the unbelievers. If you look back at the story, the Arameans aren't any different than any other enemy of God. Here's what I believe, and here's what they believe. If I could just capture and eliminate the man of God, then everything would be fine. If I could just eliminate the Bible, everything would be fine. If I could just eliminate church, everything would be fine. If I could just eliminate morality, everything could be fine. If I could just eliminate those things, all problems in the world would be solved. At least according to the enemy of God's thinking. We see it just as strongly today as you do thousands of years ago with the Arameans. So they come in after Elijah, and he prays this kind of delusional physical blindness as well as a spiritual blindness over them. And they think they can see. They believe what they see. The thing is, what they see is not reality because they can't see. And that is the life of an unbeliever. That is the life outside of God. So Elijah confuses them. He tells them they are seeking the wrong person in the wrong city. And he leads them on a 12-mile walk into Israelite capital. And as he does, they're truly defenseless and they're truly vulnerable. Elisha has them right where he wants them. But then he does something that no one expects. And he opens their eyes. He has the king throw them a feast. And he lets them go. Not your typical story. What do you think they were expecting when their eyes were opened? My guess is they were expecting judgment. Because that's exactly what they deserved. But yet they got a feast full of grace. A feast full of grace. I told you it pointed towards Christ, didn't I? When Christ opens your eyes to who you are, when Christ opens your eyes to what you've done, when He breaks that stone heart in two and He makes it a heart of flesh, we realize we deserve judgment. But God gives us a feast of grace. and he pours out his grace, and he pours out his mercy to us. And you know what? My guess is, I don't want to assume too much about people in this room, but many of us in here are currently in the same delusion that we meet when we see the soldiers meet Elijah or Elisha. We have thought or still think that God somehow is our adversary, that his rules are bad, they don't fit with the times of today, they're too restrictive, and he obviously doesn't care about you. He's not working with your plan. He's abandoned you at the lowest parts of your life. To steal a phrase I heard this morning, that feels like God took a dump on my face. That was the words I heard this morning. And there's truth in those words. But here's the thing. We think what all he wants to do is send us to hell, put us through hell on earth, and then send us to hell. So our life is constantly this uphill battle of trying to prove ourselves to him over and over and over again. We think we know God, but we only know what we want to know about God. We only see what we want to see about God. We're in this delusional state. Like this Aramean army, you're going to find out that capturing God and eliminating him is not going to be the answer. To eliminate God and chase after a job or chase after a relationship or chase after a bigger salary or chase after that bigger fame or chase after that bigger success, it's all going to leave you empty. The only thing you're going to find joy in and when you are looking is not to be capturing God, but instead be captured by God and his grace. God has something greater for you. The first step is having our eyes open to the reality of who we are. Romans 5:8 says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still far from him. The second step in that is realizing who God is. That while he is perfect and we as sinners cannot be in his presence, he is a merciful, loving Savior that wants you as a part of his family. So the next step is repentance. To say, God, I know who I am. I know who you are. I need to turn from that old way of life. I need to burn the plow. I need to cut up the oxen. I need to give all that junk away. And I need to follow after you. Every step after that is just an eye-opening step that follows him to something greater, even when we can't quite see it.